Y'all want to know one of the hardest things for me to do? It's to not speed when I'm late for church. You know what's even harder than that? Is not speeding when you're the preacher or the teacher. And yes, I did get up extra early this morning. So before anybody says, you need to get up earlier, Dave. One of the good things about being a substitute teacher, and it is nice to, I'd much rather be a substitute teacher in a Bible class than I would in a school. It's a whole lot nicer to do that, that's for sure. But of course, everybody knows that substitutes, like everything else, you know, let's think about substitute sugar. Is it anywhere near as good? Substitute coffee? Nah. So, yeah, the substitute teacher is not usually anywhere near as good as the real thing. But I do like getting the chance to do this. One of the great advantages, you do get to kind of talk about what you want to talk about. The disadvantage to it is if you don't get it done, you don't have next week to finish off what you got to do. And a few weeks ago, we talked about Cornelius, and one of the things that we learned about him was that he had great leadership qualities. And right now, there's currently a big effort going on in both the civilian and the military world, trying to change people's thinking about what makes for a good leader. And they're starting to realize that the old school concept of the manager who is the one who directs everything and tells you what to do and what to do it, how to do it, and when to do it, and is sort of just riding herd over all their people, that concept doesn't work very well. And so they're trying to change a lot of those things. And so there's countless books and training courses out there, consultants who are traveling all over the country, teaching people the principles of good leadership and principles that are, coming out that are different than that old school form of management. And I know a lot of you have worked for those sorts of managers in your lifetime. And to a great degree, that was kind of just expected as to that's how managers worked. And so it's really common to see people online on social media and places like that quoting some sort of new leadership principle. And it really strikes me as funny as to how many of them come from the Bible. And when we look at them, we can see as Christians, we can see they're touting all these things as new that are things that we already know. And so it's kind of, in one respect, it's kind of sad because people are just sort of now kind of discovering that sort of stuff. And that things that God laid out from the beginning for all of us, and we understand that, and we see all these other people all of a sudden now just going, hey, this is a great idea to be this way. And you're kind of like, wow, maybe if you'd been in your Bible a little bit more and applied this, outside of sitting in your church, then maybe you would be a different kind of person. Maybe you would be a different kind of manager. So we already know what they're figuring out. But a lot of times we just don't understand that we know that sort of stuff. And today we kind of, think about, we have a tendency still, when I say the word leader, what do you normally think of? Do you normally think of someone who's in charge of things? That's, for most of us, that's what we think about when we hear the term leader. We go, okay, that's the person up front. That's the person out front leading the charge. That's the person who's telling everybody what to do. That's the highest elected official, or it's the CEO of a company, and that's what we have a tendency to think about. If I ask you as a Christian, who would you say our leaders are if I asked you that as a Christian? Okay, elders. Who else? Deacons. We can throw preacher out there, right? So that's the ones that would normally come to mind for us. And so a lot of times people will list preachers, elders, and deacons. Now I'd like to just stop for just a short moment just to kind of bring something up. It's just something to think about. But a lot of times when you ask the question, or where you hear someone, let's say, teaching a Bible class or preaching a lesson, a lot of times when they're talking about leadership within the church, what order do you hear them list that in a lot of cases? In a lot of cases, you'll hear them say, who's the leaders in the church? And they'll say, preachers, elders, and deacons. Now think about that for a minute. Is that really right? I mean, what sort of message is that sending when you say preachers, elders, and deacons? Because what do we do as human beings? How do we list the most important one normally? Normally first. Okay? Shouldn't be that way, should it? All right? Now, a lot of times it's just habit, right? People aren't necessarily thinking that in terms. But in a lot of cases, people are thinking that way. You know, when someone asks them a question, someone says, hey, what do you think about this, about the Bible? And the Christian doesn't know the answer to it. What's their response a lot of times? Yeah. Let me go ask our preacher. All right? Think about the qualifications of elders versus qualifications of preachers. Is there a big difference? Yeah, absolutely. So really, if they're the ones that are shepherding our souls and they're the ones that are supposed to really know the most and be most spiritually mature, who should we really be saying that we're going to go ask? If we're going to go ask anybody besides studying it for ourselves first. Yeah, the elders. I read an account once of a guy who went into a church. It wasn't a Church of Christ, but he went into a church, and up on the back wall, just as you came in the front doors, there was a picture that says our staff. And he looked, and it was the preacher and the associate ministers and the secretary. It was pictures of all of them across the back row. And he said he went around back the corner by the bathrooms down a side hall, and right outside the bathroom was the pictures of the elders. Kind of sends a little bit of a message, doesn't it? So just something to think about, you know, as we think in our lives, as we're working as Christians, let's make sure we have things in the right priority, right? And remember really who the leaders are. And if you think about it, really, you know, when we start talking about deacons, do we normally refer to deacons as leaders, or do we use a different term for them in a lot of cases with deacons? What do we say deacons are? Servants, right? Because that's what the Greek word is. But guess what elders are too? They're servants. Guess what the preacher is? Guess what we are? Yeah. And in fact, that's one thing that's being talked about in the corporate world is when they talk about leadership, they're talking about servant leadership. And that's the big catchphrase with all of that. And again, like I said, those are things that we already understand as Christians. Maybe we're not so good at putting them into action. And sometimes we think about it a little bit wrong, but we understand those particular concepts. So that was just a little side note, but something to think about. Make sure that we're thinking in the right terms, that, you know, who's first? The elders are up there first. If we have a question, let's go to the elders. You know, a lot of times they want people to be talking to them anyway. And I'm sure the preacher a lot of times would like to be able to pass that off to the elders. In fact, in a lot of congregations I know of, when someone asks the preacher a question, they say, let's go get one of the elders. And let's have you talk to one of the elders about that, which is a good thing to do. When we look at, when we look at those that are leaders in the church, you know, we look at characteristics that all of us as Christians are supposed to have, right? Is there really any characteristics of elders that, you know, most of us should not strive for? You know, most of them, you know, okay, do we have to get married? No, we don't. But a lot of those other characteristics that elders are supposed to have, those qualifications, we should be striving for as Christians too, right? We've heard that plenty of times in lessons before. And it's, strangely enough, even in the military, they're telling everybody now that everybody should be a leader. It's not just something for generals anymore. So what I want to do this morning is kind of look at some of these new principles of leadership that the world is sort of starting to talk about, and look at where they're at in the Bible and see where they've already been taught. But the other aim for this morning is as we're going through these, I'd like for you to, you know, as we're covering them, to start thinking about how can I do these things in a very practical way. What sort of things can I do to show leadership, to be a good leader? And again, I'm not talking about usurping the authority of the elders or anything like that. I'm just saying there are qualities of leadership that we can all have, that we should all be exhibiting. And if we're going to grow as Christians, then we should always be looking to increase those things, shouldn't we? So that's kind of what I want to do this morning. And of course, you know, if we enact these good leadership principles and we start to grow them, what's that going to do for the church? It's going to help us to be a stronger congregation, isn't it? It's going to help us to strengthen our brethren. And it's also going to strengthen our lights as they're shining in the world, because we're going to be also exhibiting those in the workplace, in the community, at the grocery store, whatever that happens to be. You know, you think about standing in line and somebody in front of you is buying something and they're like, oh, I just don't have enough money to buy this. Well, if you say, hey, I've got it, what are you exhibiting there by doing that? That's servant leadership, isn't it? You're saying, I've got it for you, I'll take care of it. You know, I'm a Christian. This is the sort of thing that Jesus would want me to be doing. You know, and that's, we need to think more and more on those terms. So I'm going to go through some of these characteristics, just listen to what, and these are the ones that get talked about all the time online. Listen to them, and then we'll talk about them just a little bit. So just go through the list. 1, they seek your advice and input. And just talking about leadership, and these people, they're saying this is what they want worldly leaders to do. They seek your advice and input. They admit that they don't know it all. That's a big change right there from what managers used to be. Used to be managers would never admit to being wrong about anything, and they always had all the answers for everything. And now they're kind of flipping around saying, nope, managers need to admit when they don't know things. And it's true. You will gain credibility with your team if you do that. They let you shine rather than taking credit for themselves. Anybody ever work for a boss that took all the credit for themselves? Yeah, you work long enough out there in the workplace, you're going to run into a handful of those. They are humble. They recognize your contributions and express appreciation publicly. They have your back and will stand up for you. They are teachers and mentors. They are always truthful, even when it's painful. They challenge you to do bigger and better things. They apologize when they are wrong and admit to personal error. Anybody ever been surprised when their boss admitted to personal error? That's kind of a rare thing to run across. That's kind of a rare thing to run across out in the world, anywhere we're at, right? People don't want to admit that they're wrong. Well, now they're telling people, no, you need to. And believe it or not, if you admit that you're wrong to some people, a lot of people say, well, they're going to look at me poorly because I admitted to wrong, that I made an error. You know what? Just the opposite happens. They say, wow, that person's just like me. Then they know that they can trust you later on because they're going to tell the truth about things. They treat everyone with dignity and respect. They don't show favoritism. They care about you personally. Now, let's go through that list again. But now let's start thinking in terms of attributes of Christians and see if they don't match up the same way. So for Christians, they seek your advice and input. They admit that they don't know it all. Have you ever heard any of the elders here when they're teaching a class say, hey, I don't know all the answers to this? How many of you thought, well, he's not much of an elder because he didn't know the answer to that? Well, nobody thinks that, right? At least nobody that's mature thinks in those terms. And any Bible class worth their weight in gold is going to tell you, hey, I don't know all the answers to this. That's actually one of the disadvantages of being a teacher and studying, is you start to realize there's more that you don't know than you do know. And it gets a little bit discouraging sometimes because it's like, wow, I'm just never ever going to know all of this. And it's become blatantly obvious to me how little I really know. They let you shine rather than taking credit for themselves. They are humble. Another great Christian attribute, right? They recognize your contributions and express appreciation publicly. They have your back and will stand up for you. They are teachers and mentors. They're always truthful, even when it's painful. They challenge you to do bigger and better things. They apologize when they're wrong and admit to personal error. They treat everyone with dignity and respect. They don't show favoritism. They care about you personally. So you can see, as Christians, we all know that we're supposed to be doing these things as Christians, and the world is just now sort of starting to kind of figure out these are good things to be doing in the business world. So for all of us, we should have a jump on all of these other folks out there that are just now learning this stuff, because for a lot of us, we've been taught this since childhood. And in fact, that was one of the difficult things for me going into the business world, because I had been taught these things from childhood, and the business world's like totally different, and it was a little bit of a shock. And I stepped on a bunch of landmines because I didn't know that the world was so different in how they reacted versus how we'd been taught to act. So please, as we go through some of these things, think about how you can do some of these things in your work life and in your personal life and even as a Christian. So one of these first leadership principles: leaders do what's right even when everyone else is against them. Now, who can you think of from the Bible that did what was right even when everybody else was against them? The first one that comes to mind for me is Noah. Right? If you think about it, in Genesis 6, God's despairing over the wickedness that's overtaken humanity. He's gonna destroy humanity. And Noah and his family are the only ones that aren't corrupted. You think about that. Everybody else in the world was corrupted. Now, how hard would it have been for Noah and his family to remain righteous when 99.999% of the rest of the world had become corrupt? You know, at least with us today, there's still people around us, even though they might not be Christians, there's still moral people around us, right? Noah was surrounded by complete immorality to the point that God just wanted to wipe it all out. How difficult must that have been for him? And as Noah's boarding the ark, God says to him, "For you alone I have seen to be righteous before me in this time." For you alone. You want to talk about loneliness, right? You know, doing the right thing. Before me in this time. And so literally the whole world was doing wrong, but that didn't deter Noah from doing what was right. That's a leadership quality. You know, regardless of what's going on around you, because as human beings, we want to have people agree with us, don't we? You know, that's the thing about humans. It's like, do you think what I'm doing is right? Right? We want people to affirm that what we're doing is the right thing. And some of the stories I could tell about that. But think about who else. Who else can we come up with that fits that characteristic of doing the right thing when everybody else is doing the wrong thing? Can anybody think of any others? Moses. Daniel's a real prime one, isn't he? And even though he wasn't completely alone, right? Because who else did Daniel have? Right, the three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and I can never right offhand remember their Hebrew names. But he at least had those guys. But still, they almost seem to be a little bit side characters in respect, in comparison to what Daniel is. But Daniel's basically standing right out there, isn't he? What about the prophets? When we look at the prophets through in the times of the kings and stuff like that, how many of the prophets, you know, basically said, we're the only ones here. We're the only ones speaking out. Everybody else is turned against us. You know, there's no one that's on our side. And what did the people do to the prophets? They killed them. They said, we don't want to hear it. So if you want to talk about somebody that's against you, they're against you enough to just kill you for speaking what's right. How difficult must it be to do the right thing and say the right thing when you know that they're going to try to kill you and may be successful at that? So we look at that. So the question is, what about us? You know, what can we do? Well, sometimes we need to be standing up as leaders, even though everybody else is against us. And it certainly, in a lot of ways, seems to be turning that way in this country, doesn't it? With a lot of things, with people wanting to silence Christians and silence what they're speaking about. So it may come a day where we have to think in terms of, am I willing to go to jail? Am I willing to have everything taken away from me in order to stand up for what's right? Leaders embrace the unknown. You think of someone who basically didn't know, you know, what the end outcome was going to be, was told to do something, but then went ahead and did it anyway. What's that? Esther? Yeah, that was going in before the king. She had no idea, right, what the king was going to do, how he was going to react, because she hadn't been called into his presence. What about Abraham? God came to him, well, Abram at the time. God came to him and said what? Get up and go. Did Abraham know where he was going? Oh, God said basically, get up and go to a place I'm going to show you, right? And what would a lot of us want to do if someone said, hey, get up and go. Just pack up your whole family, sell your house, pack up and go. And I'm going to tell you where to go. What's our first question going to be? Yeah, where? Yeah, sorry, I don't want to go live in downtown New York City. I don't want to go live in LA, all right? I don't want to do that. And if you tell me that's where I'm going, well, we're going to have a little discussion there. Abraham didn't do that, did he? And so Abraham basically has to leave his comfort zone and, work towards, some uncertainty. But he's asked to have faith and then to demonstrate that faith, wasn't he? And there's other examples of where Abraham didn't know how things were going to turn out. What other time did he have where he showed some leadership and he didn't know how things were going to turn out? Yeah, Sarah, he wasn't, he was actually, because he didn't know how things were going to turn out, he was trying to make them kind of turn out the way he wanted them to, right? What about Isaac? Did he know how that was going to turn out with Isaac when God said, hey, take your son and go sacrifice him? I mean, in his mind, it was going to be Isaac was going to be dead, and yet he knew that God had promised something. So he was like, okay, well God's going to figure this out somehow, right? But he didn't know exactly. And think about even Isaac, right? Isaac himself really didn't know how things were going to turn out. Isaac was, in all rights, probably assuming he was going to be killed, but he didn't know what lay beyond that, did he? At least with us in this day and age, we know what lies beyond death. But a lot of times the folks in the Old Testament really didn't have a concept of what lay beyond. I mean, how much space do you see in the Old Testament talking about heaven in the sense that we see it in the New Testament? They don't have anywhere near as much indication of what, when we talk about the afterlife, is in the Old Testament. Other examples, Peter walking on water. Did he know exactly how all that was going to turn out? No, he just got out of the boat, but he didn't know how that was going to turn out. So we have lots of examples of that. And one of the things that's interesting about this is if we look at these characteristics, what's that? Mary and Joseph, yeah, absolutely. Well, even Joseph taking Mary and God saying, well, you're going to have this son is mine, but do the right thing, Joseph, here, and just have faith here, or even getting up and going to Egypt. I mean, you go on and on and on. And that's the interesting thing about these is that I'm just pulling a few people out here. But if you think long enough about all of these characteristics, you can find multiple people through the Bible that do these sorts of things. So what I'm also kind of trying to do is kind of redefine leadership a little bit too, so that you can see that leadership is not just the big person that's in charge. It's people doing everyday things, but doing them in a godly way that show leadership. And I want us to understand that we're all leaders by the things that we do and how we think. Leaders endure through difficult circumstances. Who can you think of in the Bible that really endured through a lot of difficult things? Who? Paul, he's one. Job. What about Joseph? We look at Joseph in Genesis 37. Really tough early life, right? Sold into slavery by his brothers, although his brothers initially were going to do what to him instead of selling him into slavery? Yeah, they were going to kill him. So that's pretty tough when all your brothers want to kill you. And you have one brother that just sort of talks him out of it. That's got to be a hard thing. We don't get along with our families all the time, right? But how many of us have ever seriously thought about, as a group, of killing one of our siblings? That's a pretty bad situation to be in. So he's sold into slavery. He's framed by his boss's wife because he won't commit sexual immorality with her. He's thrown into prison. He interprets a dream that gets somebody out of prison, and the person forgets about him and leaves him in prison. And then he ends up becoming second only to Pharaoh and is able to save his family from starvation. So God puts Joseph through these tough times in order to be able to save others. How many people would normally resent that? How many people would resent, why you put me through all of these tough times for somebody else's benefit? A lot of people don't want to do that. That's not fair. Why should that happen to me? Why should you do that to me? Let them go through the tough times. You know, I had to shoulder all the burden of this all by myself for their benefit. But you think about it, what does a Christian do? When you think about Jesus, what example did he set? He shouldered all of that burden and took on all that pain and all that suffering, not because of what he did wrong, but for our benefit, right? He went through all of that for us. So in essence, Joseph was showing very much, and of course we see when his reaction with his brothers, when they finally, come back and he starts to talk to them and they're like, well, they're afraid because it's like, well, we did all this bad stuff to you and, we don't know how you're going to react. Are you going to kill us or what? And what does Joseph say to them? Yeah, he said, yeah, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. And in essence, he's saying, I was happy to do that for you because it meant your salvation, your physical salvation of not starving to death. So I'm happy that God used me in this way. What a great spirit that he had. Who else endured through difficult circumstances? We've already mentioned those, Job, Daniel and company, Paul in prison, and the list goes on. John on Patmos, the early Christians under the Roman persecution. All of these folks were enduring through difficult circumstances. And if you think about it, when you endure through difficult circumstances, what sort of message does that show to the world? You think about people that when difficult times come, what do a lot of people do when difficult times come? What's that? Yeah, a lot of people just sort of fall apart, don't they? Oh, I don't know what I'm going to do. This is horrible. I'm going to give up. I'm just going to quit. Nobody should have to go through this. And you see people sort of fall into themselves, don't they? Well, when Christians are undergoing tough times, and yes, Christians fall apart sometimes too, right? But normally in a lot of cases, a strong Christian will do what when tough times comes along? They'll pray, they'll endure, they will say, I'm not alone in this, I've got God helping me, I've got my Christian brothers and sisters helping me. They don't fall into a big blubbering mass of jelly, do they? They lean on each other. And so when people of the world see that, then it's an opportunity for them to say, tell me about this hope that lies within you. How is it that you're able to go through all of this and not have this really horrendously bad attitude? Well, let me tell you why. And that's one of the ways that we can show that leadership. Leaders also stick up for their people. You think of a leader who really stuck up for their people. Moses. Moses is a great one. Now, admittedly, God had to do a little bit of motivating for Moses, right? He had to pull Moses aside a couple times, but that's also a great principle of leadership is that God mentored Moses, didn't he? Moses kept coming up with excuses, and so what did God do? He says, okay, well, I'm going to take away this excuse. Oh, another excuse? Okay, I'll take that one away too. Yeah, okay, you can say all you want that you don't speak very much. We'll let Aaron do that for you. And we'll give you this and we'll give you that so that, you don't have any more excuses. And finally Moses says, okay, well, I guess I don't have any more excuses. Sometimes God does that with us, right? We make excuses about some things and we got to be careful because sometimes he'll take that excuse away and maybe we didn't want that excuse taken away from us. But eventually Moses gets past all of that, and he makes a great statement to Pharaoh that's a great leadership statement. And what's that? What does he say to Pharaoh? He says, "Let my people go." Right? You got to think about that. He's standing in front of Pharaoh, and he basically gives him an order to do that. In most cases, back in those days, when you did that with a monarch and you gave them an order, what was probably going to happen to you? Death. And it was quick and on the spot. No big long trials, no appeals, nothing like that. It was just like, take them out, or right there on the spot, you're dead. But we also need to remember, too, that Moses was still showing leadership characteristics even early on. We give him a little bit of a bad rap at that time frame when he's making excuses to God. But what did Moses do early in his life that showed leadership? Yeah, remember the Egyptian that was beating on the Hebrew, and he came up and killed the Egyptian? Maybe not appropriate to kill the Egyptian for beating the Hebrew, but nonetheless, he was standing up for his people, wasn't he? And of course, later on in Numbers 14, you remember in Numbers 14 when the people rebelled and God decided he had had enough. And what was God going to do to the people in Numbers 14? He was going to wipe them out. He said, I'm done with this. I'm done with this rebellious people. I've done all of this for them. And he tells Moses, that's it. I'm done with it. Going to wipe them out. We'll start over again. And what does Moses do? Yeah, Moses stands. He doesn't stand up to God. I don't like that term. He stands up for his people in front of God. And that's amazing, because put yourself in Moses' shoes, and you're talking to God. You're talking to God, almost face to face with God. How many of us could even, I don't know that I could even get one word out without falling into a blubbering mass standing before God. And yet Moses is able to do that. And absolutely. And that's amazing. That's a good point. Moses was tired of the people too, and yet he still stood up for them. And of course, we understand that with our families. We get frustrated with our family members sometimes, don't we? But do we still stand up for them? Yeah, we do. But interestingly enough, when he's talking to God, he doesn't just say, "God, please don't do this." If you read Numbers 14, he goes through a whole discussion with God, this whole defense, and saying, "Yeah, but if you do this, people are going to look and they're going to say, oh, yeah, you're not as powerful a God because of this and because of that." And so it's amazing that he's able to have this whole discourse. It shows his leadership skills. The thing is, Moses, Hebrews 4:16 had not been written yet, but Moses understood it. Remember Hebrews 4:16, "Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need." So draw near to the throne with confidence. Moses understood that. He was confident standing before God. Leaders lead by example rather than command. So in other words, they lead by example rather than just telling people what to do. They lead by example. In Joshua chapter 24, after leading the people to the new land, you remember what Joshua says to the people right before they go into the land? They're getting ready to go in. What does he say to them? He says, "You choose today who you're going to serve," right? But then what does he follow it up with? "But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." He doesn't stand up in front of everybody and say, "You're going to toe the line. I've led you through all of this, all these conquests and everything else. You're going to do what I say, and you're going to like it, and you're not going to argue with me about it." He doesn't say that. Would he have been in his right to say that? Yeah, he was kind of the head guy, right? God had put him in charge. By this time, because what's happened now? Where's Moses at? Yeah, Moses is gone. right? So Joshua is now the head guy. But instead he just says, all right, it's up to you now. You got to make a decision. We're doing this. You decide what you want to do. And then what do the people answer in return? Yeah, we're going to do it too. Now, admittedly, they had issues, right, after that. But I believe their hearts at that particular time were in place, in the right place. Leaders rise to the occasion. In Isaiah chapter 6, Isaiah has a vision in talking to God. And what does God say to Isaiah in the early part of Isaiah? He says, who can I send to my people? My wayward people, who can I send to? And what does Isaiah say? Here am I, send me. What would have, put yourself in an everyday situation and the boss comes out and says, hey, I don't know what to do. I need to find someone that can do this particular job. What do a lot of people say? Well, yeah, Bob would be good at that. Tom would be good at that. I don't know who you're going to send. I don't know who you're going to have do this, boss. I'm just not sure. Isaiah jumps up. And Isaiah knows that he's signing up. Is Isaiah signing up for a hard job or an easy job? A hard job. He already knows it because he knows how the people are, doesn't he? And he says, but that's fine. I'm willing to do this. You look at the number of times in a congregation when the elders get up and they say, hey, we need someone to take this on. And I'm not necessarily talking about this congregation. I'm just talking about congregations in general. They say, we need someone to take this on. And you know how many times it happens that nobody ever says anything? Or it's the same person. It's the same person every time. You know the old statistic that 20% of the people in a congregation are doing 80% of the work. Right? That's not right, is it? And there's things that all of us can do, and we're going to talk, maybe, if we get to it, about some of the other principles of leadership that go along with that. But leaders take initiative. They're the first ones to speak out. They're the first ones to raise their hands. They're the first ones, and they don't shrink back into the crowd when there's something that needs to be done. Leaders maintain the resolve regardless of consequences. Again, we go to Daniel, right? Daniel knew when the edict was made about praying only to Nebuchadnezzar, right? What was the edict made about praying to Nebuchadnezzar? If you prayed to anyone else besides Nebuchadnezzar, you were going to be put to death. Do you see Daniel hesitating? Right, to make sure everybody could see, right? So they don't shrink back because of the consequences. And of course, what were the consequences for Daniel? Being thrown in the lion's den, right? Right? That's pretty scary. You think about, remember what happened to the people that accused him? What happened to the people that accused him after Daniel came back out of the den? They were thrown in. And what does it say about when they were thrown in? They didn't even reach the bottom before they were devoured. I think those were kind of hungry lions. Not like an animal sitting around waiting for something, and oh, dinner's here. It's like, no, they're ready. A lot of people don't realize too, that was their families as well. So women and children got thrown down there as well. Which shows something about leadership as well, is that if you're a leader, then sometimes your family has to suffer some of the consequences of choices you make as a leader as well. Whether those are good or bad consequences depending on your choices. We think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace, right? They knew the same thing. They knew the consequences of their choices. They still did the right thing. Paul, when he stood up and spoke, he knew the consequences for that, didn't he? He knew what was going to happen to him. If we think about Stephen, Stephen knew how that was going to turn out when he spoke up. John the Baptist, when he spoke up about Herod marrying Herodias, what happened to John the Baptist? Yeah, he was beheaded for that. You know. The next principle is leaders speak the truth, and we have John the Baptist in Matthew chapter 3 when he's baptizing the people, and a bunch of self-righteous religious officials come for baptism. What does he call them? A brood of vipers. He calls them a brood of vipers. Paul did the same thing. He was very truthful when it came to the fighting that was going on in 1 Corinthians 1. And then remember over in 1 Corinthians 5, he's also very truthful about what? What else is going on in the church of Corinth that he had to address? The sexual immorality that was going on, right? He was very, very truthful about that. Peter in Acts chapter 2, in the sermon at Pentecost, what does he say? It's very truthful, but very hard for people to hear. You killed the Messiah. The one you were waiting for, you killed him. Right? Now, one of the things we need to remember is that when we're going to speak the truth, how do we need to speak the truth? In love, right? Colossians 4:6 talks about your speech being seasoned with what? With grace. Right? And that's one thing that we always need to make sure that we're doing. Think about social media. How hard is it sometimes to keep your speech seasoned with grace when you're on social media? Now, that's the big problem a lot of people have right now in the world, is being graceful when it comes to what they're saying on social media. Some awful things that are said. And some awful things that have been said by the members of the church, that they did not season their speech with grace. Right. Right. And that's a very good point. We need to always remember that in written communications only, whether it's text or email, social media, if you're going to do that, you have to do a lot more writing to convey what you're trying to say and say it in the right way, because all the visual body cues that you have are gone. You know, I can walk up to you and say something in jest and have a little smirk on my face, and they go, "Oh, I know Dave's kidding with that." "Oh, you're a little late for church today, huh?" You know, "Oh yeah." But if I just say it in text, you know, I could take that as just being, Dave's coming down on me again for being late to church today. Man, I just don't really like how critical he is of situations. So if you're going to put stuff, you have to spend a lot more time saying a lot more words to convey what you're trying to say. Hey, I really care about you. I'm really concerned about you. Please take this in the spirit that it's offered, that I'm worried about you. I'm worried about how you're doing spiritually. I love you so much. You have to work a whole lot harder at doing that. And it really is better to do things face-to-face or in a phone call, where you get more of those cues that come across from people. So many misunderstandings have happened because of that. Leaders are servants. And of course, one of the most powerful images we have of that is Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, isn't it? And, you know, of course, you know, the message there is not to go wash people's feet, right? The Pope does that once a year. They go find some poor person and the Pope washes their feet, you know, once a year. Okay? Works out really good. What's the real message with washing someone's feet? Yep. Right. Right. So what does that mean? That means if you know someone who needs something done, if their toilet's clogged and they don't have the ability to unclog their toilet, what do you go do for them? Right. So that's the thing, is we always need to remember that we are no better than everybody else. And the Bible tells us to consider others as more important than ourselves. And when we do that, then we'll have that right attitude. There's lots more. I could go on for another 10 lessons with these, but that gives you the sort of general idea. So as you're reading through the scriptures, look at the different leadership principles that are shown in the scriptures to see how you can apply that in your daily lives. Thank you.